Hello. Our story begins before the tale truly starts, on a mission between a Jedi Padawan and the young Duchess of Mandalore. A mission between Obi Wan Kenobi and Satine Kryze to escape the Mandalorians hunting down the Duchess to end what was in their minds her putrid rule, despite it only being in its infancy. It was true that Satine was like her father, and it was true that she wanted to quell the civil war that left her people without direction or alliance in the galaxy. Despite her rationale being right and reasonable, she was still hunted. With Qui-Gon inside the city helping Satine's allies, the Jedi and Duchess were forced to remain on the run for the longer part of a year. However, this year on the run would only solidify a friendship. There would be no courting of love interests, simply a Jedi doing his duty and a Duchess eager to return to her people. It wasn't that they couldn't have had attraction, it was a simple misalignment of the times. Obi-Wan was doing a job that was stressful, and Satine was stressed out because she needed to be doing her job. She wanted to be with her people, but after her father was killed by the rebels inside the former capital city of Mandalore at Kaldabe, she could no longer do that. Of course, that city no longer stood, destroyed by the rebels in the pursuit of victory. In Satine's mind, she could not fathom putting anything before her people, especially not a love interest with someone that it could not permanently exist with. There was a lack of chemistry because of their stress, and at their young ages, their stress led to them not being able to be comfortable to get to a spot where true attraction could form, leaving them both bereft upon the return to the new capital at Sundari after the war ended. Obi-Wan would return to Coruscant with his master Qui-Gon Jinn, whereas Satine would begin to pick up the pieces of a crumbling society. Years later, where our actual story begins, in the year 22 BBY, several months before the Battle of Geonosis, Obi-Wan and Anakin would be brought to Mandalore. There were threats being made against the Duchess after the decision to open a new academy in the star system. Satine was opening up north of the former dome that was Kaldabe. It was a research academy, and it was seen as a boarding school, one that could hold children from K through 12 and even up to college-level students. It was a large project that Satine was heading, and she was hopeful that this academy could propel Mandalorian children into society, galaxy-wide. Mandalore, under her leadership, had already grown into a galaxy-renowned planet, but having Mandalorian researchers and scientists in the greatest facilities in the galaxy was something she strived for, among other things. This was a great way in her mind to excite an enlightened society. Due to those threats, Obi-Wan and Anakin were sent back to the planet, considering Master Kenobi was involved with protecting the Duchess before. Anakin was a first-timer from Mandalore, but his life hadn't gone much differently. The only identifiable difference was his lack of romantic attraction for Padme. Simply due to his age at the time of their first meeting, he never found her that alluring, mostly due to the stresses of leaving his mother behind, the pod race, and the Battle of Naboo. Not to say that he didn't think highly of her or wasn't attracted to her, he just never went further than the simple thought of her being pretty. As the Jedi arrived at the ceremony, everything went with simple pleasantries. Anakin and Obi-Wan bowed to the Duchess, and she graciously accepted their presence to her planet. Almec and Pre Vizsla flanked her sides, and they didn't do much or say much in regard to the Jedi. They, especially Pre, didn't like having them here. Not that there was anything planned for the event, but still. Everything proceeded with normalcy. Satine addressed the beginning of the opening, calling forth the academics that would be heading the operation of the school, then congratulating the first class to make acceptance into the school. It was an exciting event for the press, but for everyone else, mostly Anakin, he was ready for it to end. He asked Obi-Wan why they were brought here, and his master expressed that there were Mandalorians that had a desire to end this opening by destruction, and they were here to prevent it. Anakin questioned his master as Almec walked by, telling him that they were sitting in the open. What about that was preventing anything? Obi-Wan was left a little speechless as he directed the conversation into another direction. Once they moved on from the opening ceremony, the first classes started with their introductions, showing off curriculums to students and members of the press. It was a bit of a chaotic event, but it went on without any mess-ups. The Jedi followed Satine around as she sat in on an 11th grade social studies class, before popping into a collegiate-level literature class. Anakin and Obi-Wan followed her around to each of these. By the time they were finished, Anakin's eyes were pretty much rolled into the back of his skull. He didn't necessarily care for this. He understood why it was necessary and he was glad that they were doing it, but this was a job for the Mandalorian guards, not Jedi. Their mandate should have been more important. One didn't need to be a Jedi to feel Anakin's disdain for these events, which triggered Satine to ask Anakin for his thoughts on everything transpiring today. They hadn't spoken since their first introductions, considering she was running around the grounds of the new academy to make sure everything was operating perfectly. She was stressed just making sure everything was the way it needed to be and be presented as. This event wasn't just for press on Mandalore, but for systems around her. If they could be indulged to come to the planet, then perhaps they could expand the academy and bring students in from around the entire galaxy. That was the long-term hope. Satine was bridging gaps that were created due to the Civil War that had passed by nearly 2 decades before or so. She was finally getting into the soft spot, where all of her hard work was paying off for her citizens. Anakin looked at her blankly after the question left her mouth. He asked her to repeat it, and so she did with a smile. She knew he hadn't been paying attention, so she was trying to engage him a little. If he could show interest in these events, then perhaps she would be able to prove to herself that they were a success. He had said that the academy truthfully reminded him of the school inside the temple, but he whispered to her so that Obi Wan couldn't hear, telling her that he didn't exactly pay attention in that school either. It received a slight chuckle before they continued their conversation. She showed interest in the programs that they were operating out of the academy, and he listened before catching a glimpse of a room nearby and stopping. He looked back as she continued saying what she was saying before turning to address what he was looking at. It was an observatory room. While it wasn't quite the same as those seen more commonly around the galaxy, it was a room where physical systems moved about, giving the individual learners a chance to really feel the movement of the galaxy. It was unlike anything in the galaxy. Most people preferred to use holograms. They were cheaper and simpler. But with this, astronomers, mathematicians, and those interested in the sciences could come up in here and understand everything on a physical level. One could place their hand on Bothawai and follow the planet or the system on its annual trajectory in the greater balance of gravity in the universe. It was super interesting, but Satine never found herself pulled by the sciences. The arts or literatures always got her attention. Anakin looked back and commented on what she had been saying previously, before addressing this, and grabbing Coruscant and holding it in his hands, telling her that he was the center of the universe. While Satine found it a bit amusing, the camera crews who happened to be following them around caught a glimpse of it and recorded it. Anakin laughed to himself before Obi Wan embarrassedly walked in and stopped his student from being a professional goober. This added to the amusement of the situation for Satine. Everything had been so stuffy, so this was honestly a breath of fresh air for her. The group moved out of the room and continued down the hall. The rest of the day was filled with these little incidents, just breaths of fresh air that helped Satine feel a bit relieved throughout the day. Satine had her ever so judgmental Olmec watching over her like a hawk, and Pre was being himself in another part of the building, keeping his public image respected. Skywalker was able to find his own placement in this event by being around Satine. They both fed off each other's energy. Satine was vibing off of the administrator-esque presence with a stressed mind and weighing down her shoulders, while Anakin was vibing off a bored brain with a hyper-energetic mind, kept in place by the restraints of his job. However, this hyperactive mindset helped ease Satine's mind simply by how it was displayed. Had Anakin been running around like a rancor with his head cut off, that'd be more stressful. It wasn't like he was conducting himself in an immature way. He was simply filling the void in Satine's mind while she was preparing to keep up for the camera cruise. It was a several-hour ordeal, and she was worried about having mess-ups. Not that Mandalore would goof on her for slipping up here or there, but another system would make fun of her for it, and that wasn't necessary for getting this academy to galactic reverence. However, because Anakin was a little goofy, adding a haha here or there and then asking related questions to the academy, he was able to loosen up her mind. The reason this worked for her was because it was balanced. Anakin was getting his zoomies out of the way by locking onto something unrelated and then bringing her back down to Mandalore after a laugh or two. So Satine was able to free her mind and then focus on a specific outlet of information, because with Satine, Anakin was able to ask questions that didn't make him feel dumb. Obi Wan would have shushed him or told him that he'd answer it later and wouldn't, and Olmec looked like a prick, so no asking him questions that might be dumb. Satine was relatable and easy to talk to was the main point. Per their plans, after a day at the academy, Satine, Obi Wan, and Anakin would go back to the Zendari Palace with her for dinner. Everything up until this point had really become less of a political statement and or public involved ceremony. The palace was quiet most of the time, because Satine was always alone. But this was nice. It was a couple people, minus all the political faces, and they sat down and enjoyed dinner. Obi-Wan was as he was all those years before, which was really nice, and Anakin kept up his same shtick from earlier, just less vibrant. Their conversation shifted about, and as they were finishing up their appetizers, an alarm sounded. Obi-Wan rose to his feet, and he told Anakin to take the Duchess to safety. The two of them got up and ran her to the safe house as Kenobi disappeared out into whatever was happening. Inside of the safe house, Satine settled in and closed her eyes. Anakin locked the doors and turned back. The room was small, built kind of like a child's bedroom, but instead of facing a window, it was like a dungeon. The wall was covered in Beskar alloy, with indents facing the inside from the far right side of the room. In the middle, on the ground, with her back leaning against the bed, was Satine. She wasn't upset or anything, she just seemed at peace, despite the chaos of the alarms. The room was in the middle of the palace, and it seemed safe from whatever was happening outside. Anakin asked Satine what was happening, and she opened her eyes, telling him a likely attack from outsiders, more Mandalorians that didn't share their desires for peace. It was a group that lurked in a hidden location, one they couldn't find, and they came here to spook her. It never really worked. She was beyond used to this type of stuff. The palace alarms didn't mean an attack that was visible to the public, rather a targeted attack on the Duchess, and it meant someone had probably broken in. Anakin asked if she was okay, and she nodded her head. He explained what he saw and double-checked, and the only thought that ran through her head was a couple words. It felt like she wasn't real, and now it did. So much of her life had gone unnoticed by the public eye. She looked so alive to everyone, vibrant, but now she didn't know how to feel. Satine hadn't been seen like this since she was with Obi Wan, but it was like he didn't even notice either. She had her rhythm for this because she didn't have the next of kin. Her mother and father were dead, and she had to care for herself alone. Whether it was when she was a kid or when she was an adult after Kenobi left, she would settle in, place her knees up to her chest, and wrap her left arm around her legs, while settling her right elbow on the tip of her knee, and then resting it gently on her left shoulder. It was like an embrace, a hug that no one was willing to give her. But for perhaps the first time since her father died, she was seen by someone. She lowered her arm from her legs, and they slipped from her torso and slid across the floor. Anakin could see the hurt in her eyes, but it was very hard to detect. She expressed that this was her childhood bedroom, before the expansion of the palace at least. Her eyes looked over, past her bed, and up to the indents on the wall. She pointed to the first one on the left, a larger one, explaining that once the Civil War started, her windows were boarded up by her father. That one would have killed her in her sleep. She looked to another one and told him that she would have been hit in the chest or stomach with the next indent. Another couple memories, remembering each time she came in here, each time she was lost in the chaos outside of her doors. The childhood bedroom may have been a safe house, but it was a prison instead, one where she came to hide, alone. Anakin knelt down and apologized, not really knowing what to say. He didn't even have the proper words to completely react. She shook her head, tapping his hand softly, which was pressed tightly against his own leg, telling him that he needn't apologize. She needed to. Satine's hand pulled back, almost like a gut reaction, one fearful of being rejected by another soul. She said that her trauma was not his burden to bear, and it was unfair of her to levy such weight onto his shoulders. She was the ruler, he was a Padawan, and she was ashamed and appalled for throwing it at him. Anakin shook his head, telling her that it was his burden now, he wanted to hear, and she felt like she was seen, like truly and actually seen, not just in physical presence but in soul. There wasn't a space between them, they were united. Outside the door, the alarms continued ringing, and yet they were unidentifiable here. Anakin got off his knee and crossed his legs and sat down in front of her, telling her that he was all ears. His eyes met hers, and she pursed her lips, frustrated that she overshared to begin with, and she released the tightness in her face and walked through everything. He listened and even brought her joy by giving her a couple snippets to laugh or giggle at as she released a tear or two during their conversation. They held hands during this talk, and it was refreshing. but she didn't know how to feel. So much of her emotional processing had been done in the silence of her own chambers, inside of her own head, and yet she was trying to grasp them with her soul connected to another. The alarms ended during their conversation, but they never heard the ringing silence, because it simply never started for the two of them. When the time came, when there was a knock at the chamber doors, Satine called out telling them that they'd be right there. Anakin took a handkerchief he had found inside the academy earlier during the day, one that he kept as a souvenir, to wipe her left eye, removing a little tear that bubbled up at the end of their time together. Was it for the end of their intimacy of a conversation, or was it because someone finally listened to her? He didn't know, and maybe she didn't either. Anakin helped her off the ground as her voice broke as she expressed that she'd be right there again. As she stepped to the door, Anakin gripped her hand a little tighter, not hard, just gentle enough to let her know that he wanted to say one more thing. She turned back, and he handed her his communication device. Anakin said that he understood what it felt like to be lonely. They had spoken about his time in the temple, so she understood and knew what he meant. But he wanted her to send him a letter anytime she felt alone, and he would respond. If she wanted to call, she could, but he understood that she had a busy schedule, and that with such a schedule and the difference of time zones on Coruscant and Mandalore, it would be nearly impossible to line up time to talk with each other, so a letter would suffice. She smiled softly and turned her head, as if she was forcing a tear back into her body, refusing to let it show before she faced the guards. Obi Wan and the two guards would reveal that it was nothing, simply a proximity alert that malfunctioned, and the mainframe kept telling them that there was someone in the building, when there apparently really wasn't. However, due to the lateness, it was time for Master Kenobi to leave and give the Duchess her rest. So it was goodbye for now. It ended with no hugs, no embrace, and no warmth. It was a steadfast bow from a Jedi Master and his Padawan, and a pretending gleeful expression from a Duchess that really didn't want them to leave, especially not Anakin. The communication device that Anakin handed her sat inside of her hand. She tried not to crush it as she held it like it was the last piece of humanity in her life. When Anakin returned to Coruscant, he checked his room and found a message waiting for him. In the era of technology, there weren't written letters, but there was mail, and in the way it was done by Satine, it came off as if it were a written letter. It was scribed in her handwriting, and the signature at the end had her name, written as she had every day since she was in grade school, before the war. Maybe her last touch of childhood innocence, not gone yet. Anakin read the letter and truthfully got a little teary-eyed from reading it. She didn't say much, but it was concise and to the point. She thanked him for all of his time, and she thanked him for sharing that space with her. It meant more than the world to her, and she told him that she would treasure it for the rest of her life, because it simply meant that much. The next several months of each of their respective lives would go back to normal. Anakin continued his training with ease, perhaps more ease than ever before, realizing that there was another being in the galaxy that understood him fully. While their conversation never revolved around him, all of her emotions were ones that he could understand and share in. Satine returned to her normal life in the public eye. She continued to look the part of a perfect, pristine individual, one that looked like she had never had the burden of sharing human emotions, the perfect scapegoat. Their letters, while intended to be for trauma sharing, turned into an intimate expression of friendship and potentially something more. A base built from Beskar, stronger than diamond and sturdier than any relationship Anakin had formed in his life aside from the one he had with his mother. Satine did vow to try and get Shmi off of Tatooine, but by the time this vow came in, it was just a little too late. Skywalker was off with Padme on Naboo and eventually Tatooine. While Anakin never felt an original bond to Padme, due to the transition from slave to Jedi, he never really picked up on anything here either. What he had with Satine was so mature, intimate, and perfect. That was the word he used to describe it, perfect. They had expanded their bond with each other through their letters, and while it never went especially far, it was a dynamic that both of them had longed for, but never truly realized they wanted. Their souls connected in one perfect moment, one that any being across the cosmos would have waited their entire lives to find. Anakin would go to Tatooine, deal with the loss of his mother before being dragged to Geonosis, where he would lose his forearm in a contest with his great Grand Master, Dooku. When he returned to Coruscant, he had two messages. The one about Satine wanting to send aid to Tatooine to save Shmi, and the second one, where she asked him if he was safe and hoping that he wasn't sent to Geonosis to be a part of the war. Tragically, he was a part of the war, and he did lose his forearm in battle. Despite the hard beginning to something neither one of them wanted, Anakin did sprinkle a little bit of humor into his returning messages to Satine. He also sent an image of his new forearm, telling her that he never wanted a tattoo, but at least his forearm was his favorite color. Satine felt horrible about his mother, but she sent nothing but condolences. She never really addressed that she couldn't get people to Tatooine, and he didn't either, because they would have never found his mother, and that also wasn't her burden to bear. It was a genuine and sweet gesture, but far beyond her control. Satine was able to talk him out of blaming himself for the incident, because it wasn't his fault. Because he couldn't be on Tatooine, he was guarding the senator. While he wanted to reject this, he sat for a long time, reading her letter over and over again, before sending a response. She was right. Even though he disagreed, she was right, and he needed to let go of his self-blame, because it wasn't his fault, and he needed to understand that. With all the extra time, he was able to digest that, and Shmi, as Satine said, would have never seen it as his fault. She loved her son. Satine echoed that his mother would have been proud of him, and that healed his heart unlike anything else. The war would begin with relative ease, and Skywalker brought his communication device with him to the battlefront, keeping a spare and password-locked one inside of his room on Coruscant. Anakin and Satine would communicate on almost the daily basis, letters coming and going on the regular. She was worried about his service on the front lines, and of course, worried about him with a Padawan when that came. More so him than the Padawan. This was more of an inside joke, but it was genuine, being that Anakin cared greatly about those in his life. He worried about her work as a neutral leader in a time of war. It put a massive target on her head, and he cared about that, and was worried about her. But that wasn't abnormal for her. She had lived more than enough of her life in complete and total fear of assassination. She would handle this with stride. Obi Wan, on the other hand, had a slight fling with Padme begin to unfold. It wasn't very serious, but it revolved around their mutual desire to end the war. While initially Obi Wan was a frontline warrior, he was added to the Jedi High Council after the beginning of the Clone Wars, which meant he had a bit more bureaucratic stance in the war. On behalf of the Council, he was sent to work with Padme and her delegation of 2,000 to help end it. Initially, Obi-Wan was that frontline Jedi, but this changed when Ahsoka was assigned to Anakin. The Council knew that as the negotiator, he'd make a fine representative from the Jedi Council to work on a peace treaty with Padme. This didn't affect Obi-Wan's mind. He was alright with this, plus he and Padme had experience working together before, Battle of Naboo for example. Kenobi and Amidala worked together on proposals to end said war. Their work was steady and it was very official stuff. The Council was a little on edge about putting Kenobi into this environment, but he thrived in it. To him, it wasn't just the excitement at the political battleground, but the joy he had in working with Padme. They had a certain political chemistry that helped them work on bills that Padme would forward into the Senate with her delegation of 2,000. Despite their work beginning early into the war, they were dedicated to ending the war before it got too heated. Obi-Wan's time inside the Senate and executive buildings would turn more into a work wife and husband type of scenario. It wasn't like they had anything romantic or companion related when they went back to their respective homes. Obi-Wan had his council and Jedi friends, and they weren't like this. And as for Padme, it was her guard and Captain Typha, which wasn't much different from Obi-Wan's scenario. The conversations during their work hours weren't all focused on work, but most of the time it was. Unlike Anakin and Satine, there wasn't a hint of intimacy, but there was chemistry, which is why this was a good pairing for them. The entire purpose of this union was to end the war. The work husband and work wife vibe for the two of them made their allies speculate if there was something more going on, but truthfully there wasn't. Obi-Wan respected boundaries, unlike other people, so the two of them could go back to her apartment and continue working on documents. There were some other things that had to be done, but their time inside of her apartment were mostly hollow conversations about the work they were doing on behalf of the Republic. And despite how hollow they may have been, the two of them enjoyed this. It didn't add any stress to their lives, and it allowed them to benefit from the excitement of the lustful or even passionate tension that sat between them. The forbidden fruit that neither would dare reach for, because neither of them were pulled to do so. Their relationship was strictly work-related. but their true bond formed through their time together. It was through this that they found their relief. The pool of the tension gave them a sense of freedom from their work, despite how unspoken this tension was. On the other side, things were heating up on the front lines, and Anakin was preparing to return to Mandalore. Satine was going to move members of the Neutral Systems Coalition to Coruscant for an important discussion with the Republic. Satine was excited about this. Her friend Padme had been in contact with her regarding the progress she and Obi Wan had made on the potential bills to end the war. However, there was something else for Satine. The alarm systems were continuing the trigger, and some of her guards were believed to potentially be behind their activation. Guards were swapped out, and the Duchess's security was heightened exponentially due to this. Satine and Anakin were in constant contact before he sent a letter telling her that he was getting ready for a big campaign. He put a smiley face at the end and added a PS to it, expressing that Ahsoka was a little too excited for this one. Satine laughed at it, but there was almost an immediate change in her tone while she was writing her letter to Anakin. Once again, the alarms in the palace activated. She didn't erase everything, but she wrote to Anakin about how she looked forward to meeting his apprentice, and believing that Ahsoka would turn out to be an amazing Jedi Knight. When she was startled, she was moved into her childhood bedroom and sealed the door, as she always did. Satine continued writing on her tablet, telling Anakin that she had a confession. She expressed that she felt like she was in danger. However, she did not want him to worry about it. She reminded him that this communication was so that they could be open with each other, and so she was finally being open about her emotions again. Finally, free from the burden of being trapped inside of her head. She told Anakin that what she was doing was very important, but she was afraid, thanking him for always having her back. Instead of ending the letter with her normal signature, there was a change. The letter ended with 3 words, identifying that she loved him. And instead of her typical signature, it was changed ever so slightly. A shift in comfort. The peace she had found in her adolescence had manifested itself into a new comfort. Her signature changed into her adult handwriting, and rather than dotting the I on her galactic common letter, she placed a delightful little heart over it. Her past had made amends with her present, and she was comfortable. Maybe far away from her friend or whatever he was in her mind, but she was comfortable with sharing these little intimate things. Her smile lined the sides of her rosy cheeks, as her dilated pupils found the send button, and then she watched as the message left her tablet and directed itself towards Anakin. When Skywalker came back from his campaign, his heart raced with anticipation. He went to read Satine's message. He scanned through it and got a little worried as he got to the end, but the ending was sealed with the most heart-raising jolt of emotion. The I love you did wonders to him unlike anything had ever before. He could feel twists in his stomach, and at that, a sense of joy fluttering through his body. His soul yearned to see her again, unlike ever before, and he wished to see her this instant. He prepared to send a message, but was hailed to the bridge, and so he left. When he got there, Obi Wan stood with his arms crossed behind his back, as he informed his former student that his friend, Satine, had been killed in an assassination on Mandalore. The other senators, Omfrey Ta, Ken Robb, and Anakin Far, had also been killed, while Tal Merrick of Kalevala had gone missing. Anakin's heart dropped into the center of his body. The only thing he retained was Satine had been killed in an assassination. It repeated over and over and over again. It repeated until he could hear Obi-Wan's voice rise up, as if he was asking a question. What it was, Anakin did not know. He just nodded his head and bowed before leaving. When he entered his chambers, he slid to the ground in front of the bed, and he would settle in, placing his knees to his chest and wrapping his left arm around his legs, while settling his right elbow on top of his kneecap, before resting it gently on his left shoulder. It was like an embrace, a hug, one that he would never receive from her. It wouldn't be a trooper or Yularen that found him like this. Tragically, it would be his young apprentice, Ahsoka, and he didn't drop this trauma on her. It wasn't her burden. Did he cry? Not even he knew. This was different than losing Shmi. When his mother died, he felt rage, and while that was present here, he didn't know what to do. His mom meant everything to him, but hearing that Satine died took the breath out of his lungs. It took his life away, and he felt empty, unlike ever before. Why? What did she do to deserve that? So much pain, so much self-sacrifice, and now nothing. Shortly after Ahsoka left, Anakin, like a ghost, levitated from the ground and left his tablet on his bed, before leaving to the hangar bay. His message was halfway written. While it wasn't finished because he was hailed to the bridge, he, at the end, had already written what he was dying to write for weeks. At the end, with the cursor still aimlessly blinking behind the words, "I love you too." Skywalker took his Jedi starfighter and left without proper sanctioning from Yularen. Yularen didn't care anymore. Skywalker would do what he wanted, and the Republic Admiral had to make peace with that. While Anakin didn't know if he cried inside of the chambers, he certainly did when he was in hyperspace. He had saved every single letter they had exchanged, and they replayed over and over inside of his head. He wouldn't react like he did after Shmi, he couldn't. It wouldn't be right. Satine wouldn't want that. However, she also wouldn't want her planet to fall into the hands of those undeserving of the role of leadership. When he landed at Sundari, he was escorted to the palace. The Duchess's casket was prepared for the funeral ceremony. Already? Anakin thought to himself. No wonder she lived in fear. The walls were closing in. She was suffocating, and it was only a matter of time until the air ran out. Skywalker learned from Almec that there were warriors on Concordia that believed that they were the rightful leaders of Mandalore. Anakin didn't say a word to Almec. Instead, he placed his hand on Satine's casket and spoke some Mandalorian to her. It was a bit broken, but he was still learning it in an effort to try and impress her or make her laugh. Either or, yet he wasn't sure. But that missing hug, the one that he wanted so badly, the one that she wanted so badly, would never be satisfied. Anakin told Almec that he would go to Concordia, and he would return to make things right. Anakin didn't know it, but the icy Mandalorian administrator warned Pre Vizsla about the arrival of the young Jedi Knight. As Skywalker entered Concordia airspace, he was engaged by a number of Mandalorian starcraft. He spun his Jedi Delta 7 starfighter out of the way as blaster bolts sailed past him. His astromech whined in terror as he pulled the ship back, cutting the engines and dragging it around. Despite the gravity pulling him to the surface, the engine swung back on with the ignition of the reactor. He blasted forward, slamming his hand on the trigger as the first ship smashed into oblivion. Skywalker's eyes focused on his targets, narrowly avoiding a missile before pulverizing yet another starfighter. Anakin's quicker and more maneuverable Jedi starship flipped around after crushing through two Mandalorian ships. Pre Vizsla didn't have a lot of forces to work with, but from one of the Mandalorian gauntlets, a wing of jet-packed Mandalorians popped out and pursued him. Anakin dropped his torpedoes as they detonated the gauntlet, killing a couple Mandalorians in the process. He watched the survivors jetpack towards him, shooting rockets that he avoided as they landed on his ship, trying to kill him with their blasters. Rage rolled through his body as he reached his hand out, snapping their necks with the force and watching their lifeless corpses drift off the windshield of the starship. He sped forward, chasing the last gauntlet as it tried to get back to base. He fired another rocket and the engines of the vessel crippled. It spun out of control as it slammed down into the Mandalorian camp, killing a number of the troopers inside of it. Anakin told the astromech to take over, as he ejected out of the starship and landed on the ground, using the force to cushion his fall. Anakin's lightsaber rolled off of his belt as he ignited the weapon, and blocked shots from unprotected Mandalorians. They were killed almost instantly with precise movements. Pre Vizsla walked out, igniting the darksaber, telling Skywalker that it was the greatest pleasure of his life killing the Duchess, and now he would enjoy every second of killing her Jedi friend, knowing that it would be Anakin that would come to her defense. Anakin breathed heavily before moving forward. Their blades clashed in the middle. Vizsla laughed, blocking strike after strike, but Anakin was quicker. This forced the Mandalorian warrior to use his jetpack. Skywalker leapt out of the way and grabbed a pistol from the ground. Pre used his rocket to fire a missile at Skywalker, who shot the explosive round in mid-air, sending out an explosion of smoke. Anakin jumped forward, leaping through the cloud of smoke and connecting his blade with Pre's armor. However, the strike jolted him from his position in the air, sending him tumbling to the ground. Anakin thought to himself as he landed. He was trying to remember Master Windu. What did he do on Geonosis? All he could see was Satine, though. He imagined her with her arms embracing herself inside of her childhood bedroom, one that looked like a prison cell. His face scrunched up, he spoke to himself, saying Master Windu over and over and over again quietly. Pre got up and grabbed the darksaber, twisting it and telling Anakin, that Satine never saw it coming. She was just as bliss as the Jedi, just afraid as they always were, watching their grip on everything fall out from under them. He asked Anakin what it was like. He never got the chance to ask Satine. Skywalker's brow firmed, and his blade ignited off to the side of him, and looked up, telling Vizsla that he would wish Mandalore went extinct, because his loss would be too embarrassing for his ancestors to bear. Pre's eyes widened as he watched Anakin drag his lightsaber across the ground, kicking dirt into his eyes. Pre wailed in confusion. His darksaber blocked every strike he could, but he was weakening. With every strike he defended, his body was thrown from side to side. Anakin could envision Mace's kill of Jango, so he slid his lightsaber into Vizsla's ribs, cutting a piece between the best arm. Pre slipped to the ground as Anakin bashed his lightsaber against the Mandalorian warrior, kicking him in the jaw. Pre crawled backwards like a pathetic foundling. Skywalker pulled the darksaber into his hand with the Force and slashed down across Vizsla's face. Anakin again kicked Vizsla, this time so hard it lifted him off the ground and sent him tumbling. The Mandalorian warrior, afraid of losing this badly, grabbed a pistol, trying to defend himself. Anakin blocked 3 shots back into Pre's armor, before ripping the pistol from his hand with the Force and jabbing forward, sending the lightsaber through Pre's hand, before kicking in his knee, and forcing both Jedi weapons to form an X around Pre's neck. Anakin's eyes looked down on the defeated warrior, telling him that his Mandalore dies with him. The assassin's body dropped to the ground lifelessly. His head rolled off into the debris of the gauntlet wreckage, and Anakin looked back to his starfighter, the one that was currently landing behind him. Another Mandalorian crawled out of the wreckage, burnt nearly to death by the fires that consumed him in his sleep. He had seen everything, and he had watched Anakin walk through the fires like a demon. Anakin's eyes turned over to the Mandalorian. Both weapons were on his belt, and the Mandalorian begged for mercy. Anakin's eyes turned away, and a pistol that seemingly appeared out of nowhere sounded 3 times, ending the man's life. When Anakin returned to Sundari, he confronted Almec, demanding answers. When Almec confessed out of fear, there was an imprisonment and an announcement, one where the administrator informed the people he was serving about what he had done to Satine, and how her death was wrongly caused. He then informed the people that he was resigning all power to the government. Anakin was filled with rage, but it was slowly fading as his voice, one that was coarse and a little rough, told Almec that he would be taking over effective immediately, something the administrator reluctantly said, but it was finished. Anakin didn't want to abandon Mandalore. So many secrets, messages, and stories were shared between he and her. If he left them to their own devices, he could surrender them to the Separatist government, or worse, another civil war. The Mandalorian guards, per Anakin's request, would go to find Talmeric of Kalevala, and he'd be imprisoned with Almec. Because Anakin was trying to do what Satine would have done, he tried to keep her line of rule present. With a resignation from the Jedi Order and the Grand Army of the Republic, he cemented himself to her people. While he wanted to be just, like she would have, he used what Satine said she felt to address their punishment. Satine said it felt like the walls were closing in on her, like she was suffocating. So naturally, Anakin drowned Almec and Tal for what they did to the person he loved. Anakin's decision for abandoning the Order, and therefore his student, wasn't one of rational thinking. He did it on an emotion, but he also did it because, as Satine said in her final message, he loved her like she loved him. They loved each other. To what degree, that would forever be a mystery, but Anakin cared deeply about those he loved, and Satine was no different. The ceremony for Satine's funeral was the worst day of Anakin's life. He hated every second of it. He wished there was more time. He deeply wished that they could have one more conversation or one more thought-provoking letter. The letters were everything to him. Many nights he would read them to himself as he finished up his work. While Anakin felt a recoil, especially after isolating himself from the Order and his student, there was something else. The love he had for Satine started to expand out to her people. It wasn't his birthright, and he wasn't married into the family, but with Bo and Satine gone, there were no more of Clan Kryze, and so Anakin made sure that their legacy would be eternal on Mandalore. A statue of the late Duchess would be erected, and Clan Kryze would be cemented into Mandalorian history for bringing a new era of prosperity to the planet. Anakin's departure from the Order was sudden, and it did drastically affect Ahsoka, but she was strong of heart. Skywalker would eventually reach out to her and apologize, but the rest of her training would be done by Master Kit Fisto, who had recently lost his former student to General Grievous. Obi-Wan and Padme would continue their work-wife and work-husband relationship, and it would be founded in love and adoration for the other. But Obi-Wan's commitment to the Jedi Code would keep him from ever leaving the Jedi for the relationship. But what it was the key to ending the Clone Wars. The work-wife and husband concocted the perfect bill to bring forth a ceasefire and the eventual vote of no confidence in Palpatine's leadership. The process eventually led to Dooku changing his allegiances and assisting the rebuilding of a strong government for the people, with his political leverage, of course, meaning he would have to kill Grievous, and by the time that was done, Palpatine was gone. Many Jedi would be disappointed that Anakin left the Order, but it, for him, was the best thing for him to do. He kept what made him feel close to Satine, and he cemented himself a permanent ruler on their planet. All of the love that he had for her was directed towards her people. What he did on Concordia haunted him, but what he did for the citizens of Mandalore would have brought ease and peace to Satine's heart, and that for Anakin was the most fulfilling feeling of all. It took some learning and some time to fully grasp what he had to do and what he had done, but when it was understood, he, with a smile on his face, knew that in an alternative universe, his Duchess would have made him Duke. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexandra Reese, The Beginning and End, Django Fat Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Gallivant Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sirwell1767, Darth Revan, Granity Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Youngly Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, 46 Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, many 3 first names, Darksing 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash the like button. Support me always, go check out the things, PPC and Patreon. Let's talk about this story. So this was a story that I had a hard time with writing initially, and I struggled with it for a while, and so I went into my music library and I pressed shuffle, and I ended up with a song, and it's Billie Eilish's What Was I Made For, and that was the theme I went for in the story. It's a bit tragic, but I feel like the ending is a bit rewarding, where Anakin does have this dark side splurge kind of thing, but it's not, I don't believe, inherently negative because what it does. I really kind of like the theme of this intimate bond between Anakin and Satine. I think it needed to be intimate. I don't really think anything could have been the way Padme and Anakin's relationship is. I don't think it would have worked between him and Satine just because Satine's much different. And so while it's really kind of a little bit of a beautifully tragic story, Anakin on the other side comes to love all of Mandalore, all of Satine's people with the love he had for her. And so it becomes this really poetically kind of beautiful ending to a romance story. Also, I kind of like the idea with Obi-Wan and Padme kind of having the work, wife, and husband relationship. It's kind of like they fall for each other, but they don't go all the way with it. But anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.